Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend D. Scott Cooper, Assistant Minister of Congregational Life, filling in for Dr. Bosson, who is away this week. These programs are conversations with community organizers, artists, scholars, religious leaders, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joretta Marshall, Professor of Pastoral Theology and Care at Brite Divinity School. We'll be talking about how we as a religious community take care of one another during the current protests and pandemic. How do seminary students and ministers alter their approach to pastoral care during such difficult times? Dr. Marshall has authored and edited many well-respected books and articles on pastoral care, is a past president of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, and is currently on the editorial board for Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Dr. Marshall, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Reverend Cooper. It's good to be with you.
Great. Before we talk about helping one another during these difficult times, I'm interested in hearing about how universities, and especially seminaries, are planning to deal with the fall semester and social distancing guidelines related to the pandemic.
That is such a great question because it seems to change every day, doesn't it? Every university that I know of, every divinity school and seminary is trying to figure out what it means to both teach relevantly, to teach carefully, and to help prepare people for whatever ministries or vocations they're headed toward. Brite Divinity School is in, as you know, Fort Worth. So we are the progressive voice in North Texas. So part of what we try to do is to really reach out to those who are looking for life-giving kinds of theologies, liberation theologies. So our teaching has been largely in the classroom, face-to-face classrooms. What that means for us now is that we have to figure out how to present and how to help students and those who are learners in classrooms gather and gain material and content in an online format. And most of us who are of my age were not taught to teach online. So this is a really challenging time. It's also true that lots of seminaries and higher education institutions are not just rethinking classrooms, but they're also rethinking budgets because the pandemic has, as we know, had a large impact, not just on students who are attending, but on the affordability of seminary and the ability of seminaries and universities, divinity schools, to actually have the resources they need to be able to shift the way in which we teach. So it's an incredibly challenging time, but that also provides new possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're in a situation a lot of people had no way of predicting or expecting. One of the other things I like about Brite Divinity School is its focus on social justice issues. Dr. King called 11 o'clock on Sunday morning the most segregated hour of Christian America. No doubt some of the ministers and seminarians watching may be leading churches that are predominantly white. There's a resurgence of protests against police brutality and in support of Black Lives Matter. When ministers prompt their white congregants to address their embedded prejudices and entitlements, it can sometimes become really upsetting for them, and the social justice issue is suddenly a pastoral care issue as well. So what advice do you have for those dealing with these issues and those of us who are ministering to those that do?
This is a very complex conversation, isn't it? We have so many.
Very much so.
I suspect that those of you who are in local church ministries hear these issues in ways that are just intense, that raise anxieties and fears, and that tap into all kinds of things that are underneath the surface. So if you think about how long racism has been such a part of the structure, we've never not known it in the United States, right? It's always been there. So how do we begin to do anti-racist training and at the same time recognize that those of us who are white, who have a particular privilege in the world, have to let go of some of our assumptions, let go of some of the ways in which we understand ourselves in the world, let go of the power, let go of the need to lead. And instead, we have to listen carefully to others, to listen deeply to others, and to change some of our ingrained ways of being. And that is a big challenge for lots of folks, not just pastors, but also congregants and churches. If you think about the way in which churches and ministry do the work of pastoral care, we oftentimes think about pastoral care as a kind of salve for the soul, a kind of helping people, sustaining people, leading people through traumas and grief and loss. But pastoral care is not in opposition to justice. They have to go hand in hand. So if we're going to do good pastoral care, we have to also be concerned about the ways in which justice and or injustices show up in people's lives and in our churches and in our communities. So if you think about COVID-19, for example, and the way in which it has disproportionately illuminated the incredible racism that's present in our healthcare systems and in our abilities to care for people, one cannot help but think about how do we care more fully by thinking carefully about such things as insurance payments or Medicare or healthcare or all kinds of other pieces that go together with that. So this time when there's so much unrest and so much dis-ease, I hope, leads us to re-examine the way in which we think about pastoral care. It's not just caring for people in our congregations who are in a particular kind of need. It's caring for communities and bringing us all into a new wholeness or a new fullness. It's not just for those in our church buildings or those who pay the budgets. It's for the whole of the community. So this is a particularly poignant time to think about issues of justice and how they relate to issues of pastoral care.
Thank you so much for that. That's great. Some of my other questions have to do with community, so I'm glad you brought that up. And also, I don't know that it can be overemphasized how important listening is. You brought that up, and that's just a huge part for us when we're helping to support one another. It's just taking the time to listen.
Well, yeah, that's really nice because listening is really hard work. We tend to think of listening as something passive. Words come to us and we listen. But if you actively engage listening, you also have to put into the equation things like, how am I responding to this person's need? Or how am I responding to this person's way of being? Or what kinds of prejudices are getting in the way of my listening carefully and fully? And what does listening call me to do in response? So the kind of active way in which we listen deeply and listen profoundly with our heart and with our soul takes a lot of discipline and a lot of work. And most of us in our culture today tend not to listen deeply. We listen to the first sentence, and in the process of listening to the first sentence, we're trying to shape and form the way in which we want to respond, instead of listening all the way through and asking questions of curiosity rather than trying to make a response. So this moment in particular calls us to listen with ears and eyes and hearts and spirits in ways that I think are really countercultural.
That's interesting that I didn't think of it using that word, but that's so true. It's countercultural with what we're used to in our experience of listening. Thank you for that. Of course, I was lucky enough to take several pastoral care classes with you during seminary. I learned a lot, but we never covered how to help our congregations support one another during a global pandemic. This has been a curveball for a lot of us. Please give us some insight how religious communities can deal with the roller coaster of emotions that this situation has caused.
What a great phrase, roller coaster of emotions, because it really is, isn't it? On the one hand, we're getting more and more tired and more weary, and we see this is a crisis that isn't going to end in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. This is a long crisis unfolding. So the kind of stamina and the kind of resistance one has to have to such things as despair or depression or hopelessness, it is easy to tap into anxiety and fear and hopelessness and trauma, all of those pieces that come with this kind of crisis. Because in the midst of the crisis, what gets activated oftentimes is our fear or our anxiety or our feelings of anger or hurt. Or we find ways that old wounds show back up. So if we've had trauma in our history, this moment might echo some of those moments of trauma when we feel out of control or helpless or hopeless. So if you think about all of those pieces standing side by side with the need to continue to keep on, to persevere, to find the kind of grit or stamina, the kind of resiliency that one needs in order to weather a long-term crisis. And then you put that into a community, a church or a congregation, and it helps us to think about how do we nurture the spirit of resiliency in the midst of incredible depression and despair or anxiety and fear. If anything, I would think that religious communities can draw upon their traditions, their resources of faith, their rituals, their ways of understanding the presence of the Holy One, or their way of thinking about how we can both lament and have hope at the same time. That those kinds of attitudes and stances that have been so much a part of our church traditions can be incredibly good resources for us at the moment. But it takes a lot of work sometimes to hone the kind of skills of resiliency that need to show up in this moment. It's not a matter of magical thinking, or it's not a matter of hoping that something goes away. It's a matter of how do we endure and stand with one another, whether it's through a pandemic or the virus of racism or whatever else is going on in our lives. How do we stand with one another when we can't also be physically present to one another in the same way? Which I think is a particular challenge at this moment. We're used to even sitting next to people that we may not always appreciate in pews next to us or in chairs next to us at church services or in congregations. Yet we're used to kind of sitting with one another during the rituals, during the readings, during the liturgies. And we don't even have the opportunity to really sit with one another face to face, to see each other's physical presence. And I think that's raising a whole different level of loss and grief and fear and anxiety.
I'm glad you brought up grief, because I don't think people necessarily realize they're actually experiencing grief, even if someone close to them has not actually died from the pandemic. They've lost a way of life. Sometimes they've lost their employment. They've lost all the things they're used to. And it's actual grief that people go through.
Yeah, exactly. And it's different kinds of grief, right? You've just named the different ways in which we lose things, lose people, lose relationships, lose opportunities. So that the incredible losses that are happening in families and individuals and communities some of them are acknowledged when someone loses their life, or they lose their employment, or they lose their way of making meaning in the world. The kind of losses that they experience are quite widespread. There's a really wonderful psychologist named Pauline Boss, who's written a book on ambiguous loss. And part of what we're experiencing at this moment is the kind of ambiguity of losing things, and yet there's no real closure. When someone dies, there's usually a ritual of closure of some kind. We even don't have those to turn to at some moments because we can't gather for a funeral or for a remembering service or for an opportunity to celebrate someone's life. And then you add all those other ambiguous losses, like how am I going to figure out how to put food on my table when the job that I've had has let me go for the next 6 months? How am I going to figure out how to get to college or support my kids in college or to be around my grandchildren when I can't hold them in my lap? These are ambiguous losses, and they raise all kinds of ambivalent feelings. So part of what's happening, I think, at the moment is that people feel a range of feelings all at the same time. Like, I'm incredibly grateful for a house that has a space where I can work from home and that I still have meaningful work. And I feel incredibly sad about the losses that I know are happening all around me, or about my inability to respond to every crisis around me or every loss around me. So there's these kind of feelings all at once that come into our way of being, and they show up. And trying to sort them out and trying to figure out what I'm really feeling or experiencing often takes really good listening companions. And part of the work of ministry, as you know so well, is to be one of those companions, but it's hard to figure out how to listen fully in a time when you can't see each other.
Thank you. The next thing I was going to ask dovetails perfectly with companioning people through loss and listening. Those of us who have worked as chaplains are used to families, more so than whole communities, suffering. And while this is often true for parish ministers, we sometimes have natural or economic disasters that affect the entire congregation or even city. I know down here in Houston you have hurricanes and floods and things like that. But this pandemic is truly global and worse in the United States, and both Dallas-Fort Worth, Metroplex, and Houston are considered hotspots. How can ministers and faith communities better help one another when something like this is affecting, to some degree, literally everyone we know?
Yeah. How do we stay connected to one another, right? How do we find ways to connect when the old ways that we knew so well, the familiar ways, are no longer there? So how do we rebuild connections in ways that sustain us? If you think about the tasks of pastoral care are things like sustaining and healing and nurturing and liberating. These tasks of pastoral care have to take on new forms. They have to be able to reach beyond physical presence so that the old-fashioned picking up the phone and calling someone and just saying, "How is it with your soul today?" is a really helpful way to continue to stay connected. I'm really quite amazed at the resiliency of congregations and pastors these days. It's showing up in ways that I think they hadn't even imagined. For churches that never thought about putting their services online, to go from having in-person worship to something online within a matter of weeks, and often within a matter of days, suggests to me there's an incredible amount of creativity in our communities, in our pastoral leaders. And tapping into that creativity to find creative ways to gather, creative ways to stay connected, those can be really significant opportunities at this time. I'm thinking about the ways in which choirs, for example, have figured out how to Zoom their choir practices, or have figured out how to provide arrangements of music online. And if we know anything about music, it's that it touches us in ways that sometimes words don't. So to have someone's gift of music show up on the Zoom call or to show up online on YouTube, to remind us about what's important, to remind us about the way in which we are more connected than not, to remind us that there is a God who is steadfast, and to remind us that today is not the last day or the last word, that there's more yet, to both lament, to let go of, to grieve, and to lean into hope. That really is the role, I think, of colleagues and friends and companions. So churches that have figured out how to do pastoral care in terms of lay people calling one another, checking in on one another, figuring out how to do the rituals online. Those kinds of moments actually ground us in some kind of spiritual way that I think fosters a kind of resiliency of the soul. And that can be incredibly helpful at these moments. To know that I am not in this alone, even though I am alone in my house. To know that others are thinking about me or wishing me well-being or hoping for my life in some way, even though I can't see them personally, becomes a way, I think, of continuing to carry the community into the world, because ultimately it's the way we pray for the world. It's the way we think about the world. It's the way in which we hope for God's best blessings on all of the world, not just our corner of the world. So it also encourages us to look beyond ourselves.
That's great. You totally anticipated the next thing I was going to ask about is having to switch taking care of one another in pastoral care to the phone and Zoom and YouTube. And you talked about creativity, and I love some of the ideas that you came up and some of the observations you made. But still, people are reaching out and people are making those connections.
Absolutely. I mean, even to have a list of the people in my community who are experiencing some kind of COVID-related anxiety at the moment, or a family member who's been diagnosed, or someone who has died, just knowing that others are thinking about me adds to my sense of I am not in this world by myself, that there are steadfast people around me. So I think any way that congregations and communities can get creative about connecting with one another and connecting through one another, right? This is not the job of the pastor.
Right.
It's really the ministry of the congregation, that the congregation calls forth care with one another. And the networks of care have to be, I think, supported and sustained in all kinds of ways that are different than ever before, where we could assume that there was something familiar about going to visit someone, or about seeing someone in the community at a religious service. Now we have to imagine new ways of connecting people one to another and reminding them to do so. So whether it's having a list of 6 people in my community that I'm going to touch base with once a week, just to touch base, whether it's the circles and networks of care of a Sunday school class or a church school class or a congregation religious education class, that those ways of connecting so familiarly can still be ways of connecting. And to kind of continue to sustain those during this time, I think is really important for people.
Definitely. You also mentioned ritual, and I think times like this bring out how important that is to people. One of the things we do in our video services, one of the first things you experience when you begin watching it, and I wish I could take credit for this idea, but I can't. It was Christian, our AV person, editor, and producer. But the camera walks up the steps and turns and walks into the sanctuary through the doors. And I've had so many people say how wonderful they find that experience of walking into the church, even though they can't do it personally, they're doing it virtually.
Well, if you think about the way in which our senses are alive as we live and move through the world, right? So to have a physical sense of a space that I know and trust show up on a YouTube reminds me that that place is still there in my soul somewhere. It is still feeding me. And I think that's one of the losses we haven't named very deeply yet, the kind of loss of physical spaces. I think we've begun to name the loss of physical touch. But the physical space of being in a sanctuary or a place that holds religious sacred meaning for us. There is nothing quite as profound, is there, as sitting somewhere and saying, there is a holy presence here, and that holy presence is touching me. And to recreate that in some ways, what a lovely image, to walk into the sanctuary, to walk into the building, because it's a building that's set apart. It's a building that has a sacred space in it. That's a very powerful image. Well done. That's really good.
Yeah, like I said, I've had so many people say how meaningful that is for them, and I think it's a wonderful thing. 3 words that sort of have come to mind while you've been talking are creativity, resiliency, and hope. You've kind of lifted all 3 of those up for us, and for us to keep in mind during these very difficult times. Any other comments on those? Or anything else?
No, I appreciate it. Those are 3 really important words. I think I would add a 4th word, which is lament. That lament and hope are deeply intertwined, because as we name what is wrong in the world at the moment, in whatever way we name it, a really good lament also helps us think about, and what is it that we want to have into the future? What's the hope? And why do we think there is something to hope in, or someone to have faith in? So always connecting this kind of sadness and grief and loss and lament with this turn toward hope and resiliency and creativity. Those, I think, are the gifts of the Spirit, and a gift that profoundly touches us, right? Because letting go of our laments, naming them, saying them out loud, and trusting that there's a Holy One who can hear them, what a powerful way to say, and I trust that Holy One to be present in my life in some form and fashion into the future.
That's really well said. Thank you so much. And thank you. I can't thank you enough for being with us today and allowing me to talk to you about these very important issues. You've got just profound wisdom, and I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for the work you're doing, for the work of ministry, for the gift of community. Thanks.
If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. and features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. I will again be preaching this week. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We will see you all online soon and in person as soon as it's possible for us to gather again. And please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.